second time for return visit Professor David Pasig with us, who's with us on Tisha B'Av for a wonderful and fascinating look into the future of the world, into Judaism. We were at the point of hearing the nafka mina, the most important stage that we are about to enter into, and where Professor got cut off. We will be looking forward to hearing that. Professor Pasig is an Israeli futurist, lecturer, consultant, and best-selling author, and also associate professor at Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel, where he teaches at the Graduate School of Education. And he has served as the chief advisor to the Commissioner for Future Generations in the Israeli Knesset. Professor Pasig's bestseller books are The Future Code and 2048. Each has received Israel's coveted Gold Book Award. His most recent book, For Cognito, The Future Mind, was published in January 2013 and was at the top of the Israeli bestseller list. His upcoming book is titled The Future of Judaism, Israel and World Jewry, 2100. And so we're going to hear more about that this evening. And so with no further ado, I will pass things on to Professor Pasig, who will hopefully pick up where he left off in finishing his presentation, and then to John, the moderator, for the questions and answers.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, first of all, in the meantime, during the last couple of weeks, I was able to have somebody donate to translate the book to English. So it will probably be also in English in a couple months or so. So I'll be glad to share some ideas later on if you wish. Actually, I just started looking for a publishing house that will be interested into publishing the book in English. What I would like to, and if you have an idea who should I contact or who might be interested in this kind of topic, please let me know. Anyway, what I think we were not able to cover in my last presentation is the second challenge that is in front of the Jewish world in the 21st century. And the challenge is who are going to lead the reformation, if you wish, of the Jewish narrative, of the Jewish, let's say, raison d'etre, the real reason why should we have a nation state after 2600 years, actually, okay? And I'm counting it from the first, the destruction of the first temple. So I would like to touch upon who might be the leaders. But in order to say something smart about it, I hope you already understand that we futurists, while trying to understand the future, one of the methodology we use is what we call trying to find a pattern in history in order to extrapolate that pattern into the future. So what I would like to really touch upon very briefly is a pattern I have discovered, and with that pattern, I'll try to understand what type of leaders are going to lead the fifth epoch in Jewish history. Okay, what I found is something really amazing. I couldn't see anyone in of the scholars that I was able to scan that really touched upon such a thing or a similar pattern in Jewish history. So what I found is something really striking. I found that there were about 4 eras, if you wish, in Jewish history. Each era had very specific kind of leaders, and their authority was very distinct. Their characteristics were very interesting and very defined to their role in that time in history. And what I found is basically that there were the first three epochs in Jewish history, uh, plus minus, they were about 500 years. But what I found is that at the last 200 years of each epoch, it was a very tense epoch in Jewish history. A lot of clashes between ideas, between groups, between sects. And at the end of each era, there was a historical catastrophe from which we had to reinvent ourselves in the next era that came after that. So the first era was the era of what we call the forefathers, the foremothers, the tribes, if you wish. And it took something like 450 years, plus minus a little bit more. And at the end of at the last 200 years, there were clashes between tribes with the tremendous and very cruel events that all of us are studying upon. Whoever studies the Bible, for example, the story of Pilegesh Bagiv'ah, that concubine that was cut into 12 pieces after the tribe of Benjamin, just almost killed her after a very intense evening of sexual harassment. And the Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, just cut that woman into 12 pieces and sent each piece to each one of the tribes, stating how cruel the Benjamin tribe were. And after that, actually, almost that tribe was eliminated by the other tribes, and the clashes between the tribes were very cruel, time after time after time, until uh, people said this is not the right way to govern ourselves. The tribe's mindset, if you wish, has collapsed. So they were pushing to redefine the way the Israelis will organize themselves. And a lot of people pushed towards the what we call the monarchy kind of government. A lot of people did not agree about having a monarchy in the Jewish people, because even the Torah says, be careful from monarchies, they will take you back to Egypt, etc., etc. But at the end, the prophet Solomon didn't have actually any choice, and he crowns Shaul as the first king to Israel. It didn't take long after Saul tried to establish a kingdom, until David came and challenged him with a different paradigm of monarchy, because probably, as far as we know, Shaul had a very interesting way to understand how a kingdom should behave. For example, he was very liberal in our terms nowadays, and he actually said to each tribe, you can do whatever you want, but we will just come together just to form a very united army in order to take care of our borders. But in terms of how each tribe should exercise religious customs, he actually opened it to each tribe to decide. David came with a very different paradigm that says it will not work. The only way to form a unified nation is a very centralistic kind of a kingdom with a central city, a central Bet Mikdash. Nobody will not be allowed to perform any kind of rituals by their own. Everything needs to be done in Jerusalem, and that's it. And with a very cunning behavior, actually, David eliminated the house of Shaul, and he established what we call Bet David, the house of David. That's the second era in Jewish history. And that era actually was a very different kind of era with different kind of leaderships, different kind of mindset of organization, different kind of even Judaism, if you wish. What we call now the temple kind of rituals was developed at the second era of Jewish history. However, it didn't take long because immediately after Solomon passed away, only something around 80 to 90 years after the establishment of the David's kingdom, things started going really amok because the other tribes didn't like what the house of David were doing, and they came to the new king Achav, the son of Solomon, and asked him to a little bit ease the tension between those tribes, because Solomon and David used to take each young man from the tribes about 4 months every year to take to go abroad and bring trees and bring different kinds of materials in order to build the temple. And they came to Achav and asked him to ease that challenge, that it was really very hard economically and socially for all the men to go for 4 months each year to bring whatever they needed to bring to Jerusalem. But as you all know, Achav didn't like that kind of request, and it was a matter of just a few days until we started to see about 200 years in which there were about 7 civil wars between what we call the Judean tribe and the other 10 tribes of Israel. At the end, the 10 tribes that disconnected themselves from Judea, part of them were just scattered, part of them just disappeared. Until today, we used to say the 10 tribes that were forgotten or just disappeared from Jewish history. We still think about the day that those 10 tribes will come back and rejoin the Jewish people. And at the end, also the Judean tribe with Jerusalem, it didn't take long until the killings, the assassinations between kings, etc., brought the end of that era by the destruction of the first temple. So that was the second era in Jewish history. It doesn't take long again, about 40 years, until the Persian started pushing the Jews going back to Jerusalem to reestablish their temple. But from what we know now, there were about 1 million Jews in Babylonia and another 1 million Jews in Egypt. Out of those 2 million Jews, only about something like 40,000 people accepted the invitation to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their monarchy or their nation or their country, if you wish. It was actually something very interesting in the mindset that changed in Jewish history, because whoever came in the third era to reestablish a Jewish state were what we call nowadays the priests, okay, Ezra and Nehemiah, etc. And then the Hashmonites, there were all families or priests that said, we will be able to reestablish a much better nation with some social egalitarian kind of social life with much more acceptance of God's mitzvot, etc., etc. But again, it didn't take long until those people that used to be brothers came each on his or her brother, and until it didn't take long until really the priest became very corrupt in the second temple, and out of that corruption came a different religion that was really very cruel to the Jews, at least in the last 2,000 years. So that was the third era in Jewish history. The mindset was the mindset of priesthood. But after the destruction of the second temple, came a different mindset within Jewish history, what we call now the Rabbinical Era. So the Reformation of Judaism in the fourth era was really the most significant, probably, that we know. Judaism, as we know it now, is based upon that mindset. And that mindset said, leadership is not inherited by, family ties, etc., but through what we call now, the word is maybe the word of meritocracy. If you are a scholar, then you will be the leader. It's not something that passes on from father to a child, which is, at that time, at least in history, was really something unusual in the civilizations of different people at the time. And it took about another couple centuries, and then the third century, until they wrote what we call the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And we are actually at the end, probably at the end of the fourth era in Jewish history. And the reason is, as I said in the previous presentation, that just in the last couple of years, we passed a threshold demographically in our history. For the first time, after 2,600 years from the destruction of the first temple, the largest Jewish community resides now in Israel. Okay, we are about 6.8 Jews now in Israel, and about 5.7 Jews in the US, the second largest community. And probably in 5 to 10 years, we will pass another landmark, which is about 50% of world Jewry that will reside in Israel. And 30 years from now, by the mid-21st century, we will probably be about 70% of world Jewry that will reside in Israel. As I mentioned last time, the trends are clearly pointing to the fact that probably by the end of the 21st century, there will be about 20 million Jews in Israel, another 4 million minorities, and that will be something like 80 million Jews from worldwide, as we can somehow estimate, that will reside in Israel, something that even in the first era did not happen. We know that even in the first era, actually not the first era, but the second era, the era of the kings. Even at that time, a lot of Jews resided in Jerusalem and in different places, all over the Middle East. I don't think that 80% of the Jews, even in the second era, used to live in Israel. Okay, so it will be something truly unusual. And the idea is to figure out what is the characteristic or the main characteristic that will characterize the leaders of the fifth epoch. Now, in order to say something smart about it, as I said, we tend to look for patterns, and I've seen a very interesting pattern in this slide that you see here. The pattern is something like that. On each era, there were 2 or 3 competing groups that look to be the governing elite. Okay, for example, in the first era, in the the tribes era, the 2 competing groups that were trying to take over the leadership were the tribes, the leaders of the tribes, or kind of kings that were reflected in the region at the time. In the second era, the groups of elites that competed for leadership were kings on the one hand and priests on the one hand. So the third era, there was the priests and what we call now the rabbis. They were called at the time Echad Ha'am, one of the let's say one of, how should we translate the Am here in this context? Probably one of the people, but that was a very interesting term that pointed to people that used to study Judaism, not be just leaders based on their heretic authority. By the way, Jesus was one of those people. He was Echad Ha'am. He was a rabbi, what we call nowadays a rabbi. And then in the fourth epoch, there were, of course, the rabbis. But if you can see here that on each consecutive epoch, the elite that was secondary in the previous epoch, that elite took over the leadership on that epoch, trying to bring into place a different paradigm of leadership, a different paradigm of Jewish narrative, etc., etc. For example, just to give you some sense how really Judaism have changed during those epochs. For example, in the third epoch, in the priesthood epoch, we know that it was Ezra and Nehemiah that changed Judaism according to motherhood, not fatherhood. Before that, Jews used to go after the father, not after the mother. So Ezra and Nehemiah did something they reformed actually Judaism, and there are a lot of hints to this in the Tanakh. And the idea is, can we at this point of time, we are at a very early stage of the fifth epoch that is going to probably change the mindset of Judaism, the narrative of Judaism, the religion of Judaism. Everything is going to be shaken from their foundations, as we can feel it right now. But the feeling is that something is not working. But it doesn't say that something is not working. It says that something is in transition. And the idea is, can we say something about who can take over and bring a different mindset to tackle the challenges that the fourth epoch are are living, because each epoch has its challenges, and the leaders of those of that epoch couldn't come up with ideas to tackle or address those challenges. And we know that also in the Rabbinical era, there are left a lot of challenges in Judaism, from the most important issue, which is how we define Jewish. Because in the second era, it was very clear who's Jewish. There was no such an issue even. Whoever was living in Israel was Jewish. That's it. The second era, by the way, the third era of the priests was also such a thing. If you were living in Israel, the rabbi said, Eretz Israel Mekadeshet. If you lived in Israel, you didn't have to go through a very difficult or unusual process of conversion. Only in Babylon, they have developed that idea of conversion that we are aware of nowadays. And it was cleared up when they wrote the Talmud in the 3rd and 4th century AC. And probably we're going to go through fundamental changes within Judaism, just because this is the first time in Jewish history that the sovereign authority is not God, it's not the king, it's not the priest, it's not the rabbi, but sovereignty is in the hands of the people that resides in Israel, which is something very new in the Judaic mindset that developed during the last 3,500 years. So I was very much interested to see if I can define who were the secondary or the elites or the groups that were put aside during the 4th epoch in Jewish history. So I assume, I don't think you should agree with me, but I would be glad to hear your take on it. I believe that the group that was put aside during the 4th epoch was women. And their mindset is really lacking in Jewish thinking. So I believe that the women are going to take a very important role in the 5th epoch. They need to bring a different mindset, first of all, to address the challenges that the Rabbinical era could not solve, and push and take the Jewish narrative into a different level, into a different direction, in order to continue be relevant and continue, of course, developing. Because Judaism has been developing for the last 3,500 years. That's very clear, and it will continue to develop. We have reached a point that we were just, dreaming about, that the largest Jewish community will reside in Israel just about 70 years ago. Because just 70 years ago, most of the Jews worldwide didn't believe that such a project will succeed. Now it's much more clear, and the shift is clear to many people. It is clear that the center is moving to Israel. Some don't like it because the center is having a different way to understand Judaism, but the center is going to go very difficult time in order to develop and continue developing Judaism as it has been developing during the last, at least the last 3,000 years. So I believe we are at the verge of something very interesting. I was very much interested to understand the way, the unique mindset or feminine mindset that might solve some problems that the Rabbinical era is living to for the 5th epoch. And it was very difficult to find. I went to a very interesting venue to see if I can come up with some ideas. And what I found is that there were in Jewish history something like seven female prophets. And the Midrash, in very scattered places, the Midrash was trying to understand what's so unique about the way of thinking of a female prophet, like Dvorah, like Esther, etc., etc. And I found something very interesting. I found that the way the prophecy of females was very different than the prophecy of males during those eras. And the most unique characteristic of a prophet female is that a prophet female did not just prophesize, but said very specifically what the people need to do in order to avoid or in order to enhance a trend that was prophesied by her. So a female is much more, let's say, action-oriented in her thinking than male prophets. So this is what I would like just to cover in the time I was given. And I would really open it to any kind of question you have, because I believe it raises a lot of questions. And if I can answer whatever I have in mind, I'll be glad to. That's it.
Thank you very much. Do you want to unshare your screen? Thanks, Professor Pasek.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So if you have questions, please send them to me, to the moderator. And I'll just turn on my video again. And the first question I have is from Miriam Frommer. Miriam, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask that question?
Somebody's asking? Because I can't hear it.
Yes, my husband John Frommer sent the question. He'll ask it, okay?
Do you think that Judaism will become a proselytizing religion in the future?
Traumatizing, you said?
No.
Proselytizing.
Proselytizing.
Proselytizing. In other words, go out and try and convert non-Jews to become Jewish.
Well, that's a very, very hard, question to try to address. I'm not sure I have an idea how exactly it's going to be, but it's going to be very different. We tend to see ourselves very distinct from Gentiles in the last 2,000 years. Okay, before that was not the case, by the way. Okay, all our forefathers were descendants of Gentiles females. Okay, from the mothers to even Ruth, that was Moabite. She was not Jewish. That distinction between Jews and Gentiles was something that developed only in Babylon in the last 2,600 years. So I don't know how it's going to continue in the next century or two. But I know that here in Israel, at least, there is a great debate whether someone that is not defined halachically as Jewish, but he's an Israeli, he goes to the army, etc., etc., is he Jewish or not? By the way, the High Court in Israel has defined him as Jewish. The halacha, the rabbis, do not define him as Jewish, but from a juridical point of view, he's Jewish. So we are at a very, very interesting time. It's a transition time. Things are not exactly clear, and it depends who's the Minister of Interior in Israel who gives the tone at a very certain time. But things are really fluid and will change the more we progress in time.
Thank you. Rabbi Yonatan has a question about the various streams of Judaism and the fifth epoch. Go ahead, Rabbi.
One question that I had was, might be the influence of the streams of Judaism, which have mostly come from outside of Israel? What influence might they have on the fifth epoch, in your opinion? Reform, conservative, and so forth.
Well, let me give you some perspective, okay? About 200 years ago, most of the Jews worldwide would be defined as we call them Orthodox, okay, nowadays, even though the word Orthodoxy was developed only about 300 years ago, okay? In 1810, the Reform movement was established. And in 1890, the conservative movement was established in the US. The Reform movement was established in Germany, okay? At the beginning of the 20th century, those two movements, Reform and Conservative, were the minority. However, by mid-20th century, they were the majority in Judaism, okay? Up to about a decade or so, we used to think that there are 10% Orthodox within the Jewish people, about 40% Reforms, and 30% Conservatives. Okay, about 30 years ago, it was exactly the opposite. The Conservatives were more than Reforms. However, I'm not sure you are aware of the next figures I'm going to mention here, but I've heard them from the chancellor of the conservative movement, okay? And he told me that he has very new numbers that are shocking. He said to me a couple of years ago that according to what he has in hand, there are now in the US, okay, there are about 13% of the Jews Reform Jews, and only 11% conservative Jews, okay, and about 10% Orthodox Jews, and the majority of the other people don't want to be connected or take any part in Jewish life, which is something that is mind-boggling. That explains a lot of things that are happening nowadays in the US. So things are changing. I don't know exactly how they are going to change in that matters. I know that the Reform movement and the conservative movement were the initial stage for some very profound reformation of Judaism, as we have seen it in at least the last 2,500 years. Okay, now it doesn't say that those movements are going, those denominations are going to stay as they were in the last 200 years, because we know in history something very interesting. We know that for the last 3,000 years, okay, the movements within Judaism were actually just a reaction of trends that were happening outside of Judaism. Okay, for example, the Reform movement was a reaction to something that was happening in Europe. Okay, the opening, I forgot how to say it in English, but that nationality way of thinking, or the separation of state and religion, that was something that was in the background of those two movements that were established in the last 200 years. I am pretty sure that a century or a couple centuries from now, we will not see orthodoxy as we have seen it in the last 300 years. It will be something different. We will not see what we call the modern orthodoxy. It will will disappear, okay? We will not see Chiloni as we see it in Israel. It will be something very different of the Chiloni nowadays. And we will not see also, the Reform movement and the conservative movement, but we will have other movements. That's the most interesting things. Within Judaism, we always had movements and denominations and groups and, clashes, etc., etc. But every 200-300 years, we have, terms have changed, and the characteristics of those movements have also changed.
Actually, you mentioned those figures on Orthodoxy, and two people have asked about the Haredim, and are they in those figures, and what will happen to the Haredim in the fifth epoch? Both Rona and Rachel Lustig have asked about this.
Well, I'm going to say something harsh, okay? What I found in Jewish history is something that is frightening. What I found is that whenever the majority of the Jews of the time were very much fundamental in their way of their religiosity, if you wish, the most devastating things that the Jews experienced came from that group. So the same thing here. I hope that the Orthodoxy will not reach the 35% of Judaism, because the most terrible things that came upon the Jews came from those people that suddenly realized that people are not like them, or they changed their minds. We have seen it in the Messianic movements during history, etc., etc. The difficult things came from what we will call nowadays Orthodoxy. But what I see in Israel is something that probably we do not see it from afar. Orthodoxy and the Kharadi, most specifically the Haradim, are going through very, very difficult time. First of all, the authority of the rabbis is dissipating bit by bit. You can see it all over. Even in this time of a pandemic, you can see how people don't count anymore on rabbis. And it's a very, very difficult time the rabbis are going through. Whenever a group of people is going through a very difficult time, most of the time in history, they become very aggressive. So when I see aggressiveness of a group of people, I know that something very profound is in the making, and they are afraid. Since they are afraid, they are behaving in an aggressive way. And one thing I can tell you now, that in Israel there are about something like 9 or 10% Haredim, in a very large scale of Haredim. And in about another 7% now of modern Orthodoxy. On total, there are about 17% of Israeli Jews that would be defined as Orthodox somehow, okay? But within the Haredi communities, we know that there are about 20 or 30% that are not even religious, but they are behaving or dressing up like religious people because of many other reasons. Okay, so there are things that are happening behind the scene. One of the major things is the status of women within the Kharadi movement. They are becoming more and more, let's say, aggressive in bringing their voice into politics. We are at the very initial stages of those transformations, but you can see that something is really happening behind the scenes. One of the other major thing that is happening within the Kharadi movement here is the academic studies that are going and being applied and being let's say registered in many Orthodox and Haredi communities. In Bar Ilan, for example, we have really, I don't want to say the numbers, but they told us not to speak about the numbers. We have a lot of Haredim that are coming to to do the bachelor's degree, etc., etc. So things are happening. It has happened already with the Kharadi females. Now it's the males that are going through that phase, and it's going to shake the foundations of the Kharadi movements. Not all of them, but in 30 years from now, 50 years from now, we are going to see a very different Haredim. Okay? Some say it will be the kind of Haredim of Brooklyn. Okay? I'm not sure. This is a very different phenomena. This is a kind of a diaspora kind of Haredim. Here in Israel, it's a very different kind of Haredim. They will probably call themselves something else a century from now. What if you see? What I'm trying to see to perceive history from a very large perspective, not from the day-to-day different, very insignificant trends that are happening, because there is a lot of noise within systems. The more we are aware of what's happening in systems, most of the time noise is too loud. You need to take a very large perspective and a little bit detach yourself from the present in order to see something of the future. Now, the only way to see the future is to see a pattern. It doesn't say that the pattern is 100% reliable, but this is the only way we can work with in order to see how things are emerging in the future.
Thank you. Just a reminder, if you have questions, just send them to the moderator. The next question is from David Knoll. David is the co-chair of the Reform/Progressive Movement in Australasia. David.
My question really relates to some of those percentage figures. I'm curious why population percentages like that are important. Just by way of contrast, here in Australia, we know that roughly 40% of Jews affiliate with at least one Jewish organization. It means roughly 60% do not affiliate with any. Very similar to the numbers you're suggesting, but that's been the case very steady for a very long time. Very curious whether you've seen any shifts in those figures or whether it's just you've got new implications.
Okay, as far as we know, the Australian Jewish community is different from any other English-speaking community. Okay, you are very distinct with probably a lot of reasons. I don't have the time to go over it now. What I would like to mention is how it is perceived now in the U.S. Okay, because that's the largest Jewish community now outside of Israel. A couple of years ago, there was a very large study that was published by the Pew. I have mentioned it in the previous presentation here. And what we see there is a very unique characteristic of any other religious group in the US. Okay, what they found is that there are about 40 to 43% of American Jews that don't have any link to Judaism. They don't want to have any link to Judaism. They don't want to be affiliated to anything of Judaism. They don't speak about their Jewishness to their kids. That's more than 40%. Okay? The other 60%, there are about 17% that are Orthodox, and the others are scattered in a manner that is really reflected in what I've just mentioned before, that the middle ground of Judaism is disappearing. That's the most interesting thing that is happening. The Orthodoxy group is a little bit growing. The middle ground is shrinking, and the far left, if you wish, progressive Judaism is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they are disappearing from Judaism. The more time goes by, the more that group is disappearing, and the more part of that group is becoming anti-Jewish and anti-Israelis. And that's something that is already very clear by a lot of studies. Now, this is probably an anecdote in Jewish history, what I have just mentioned, because the other trend that is in the making, the trend that the majority of the Jewish people is being concentrated back in Israel, is the major trend of our era. The 21st century is going to be the time that about 2,000 years are going to reverse themselves totally. By all means, if you remember my previous figures in the last presentation, I said that before World War II, there were about 18 million Jews worldwide. Out of those 18 million Jews, there were about 12 million in Europe. Okay? After World War II, we lost about 50% of world Jewry, of a European Jewry, and about a third of world Jewry was eliminated, unfortunately. So out from 18 million Jews, we came to be 12 million Jews after World War II. However, it takes only a century to recover, which means by mid-21st century, we will be back 18 million Jews worldwide. Out of those 18 million Jews, 12 million Jews will be in Israel. So in a matter of a century only, we are going to recover, but we are going to reverse totally the trend of 2,000 years. That's the meaning of this, of our time. It's huge. I don't think we really understand it. I don't think we can even imagine how it's going to affect Judaism in the next centuries. But it will have a great impact. It's hard to understand it. I'm trying in my book to see the major characteristic, and I have, as I have mentioned here, the sovereignty of Judaism now for the first time has passed to the masses, not to priests, rabbis, or kings or whatever. Okay, that's something very new, unusual. The people are going to define Judaism, not leaders. The masses, de facto, they will decide, and the leaders will follow. Exactly the opposite of what happened during at least 3,000 years. So exactly how it's going to play out, I don't think there is one person at this time that can really understand the long-term impact of such just a phenomena. But it is happening, and it is really very positive. For the first time, we are taking history now into our hands. We are not passive in history. For the first time, we are very active. And there are a lot of people that don't like us being active in history and taking care of ourselves. Not just from other nations, but from within the Jewish people. There are a lot of people that they don't like the phenomena of that we see here, that Israel is becoming the center. And there are a lot of scholars that are speaking about it. There are a lot of scholars that are trying to oppose this trend because it's becoming already very clear to many people. But what I think they are missing is that they think that Israel, as it used to be in the last 50 years, that's the Judaism that is going to be in the next 50 years or the next 2 centuries. There's no such a thing in history. Transformation is a constant in history. And here we are speaking about something that is unusual, some characteristic of Judaism that we didn't have up to now. And they are going to play deep into the Jewish narrative, the Jewish mindset, the Jewish characteristic, the Jewish history, etc., etc. And I'm very, very optimistic about the Jewish people. A century from now, a couple centuries from now, first of all, they will have a hard time understanding what happened. They will write libraries trying to understand what happened exactly in a matter of just, a century in Jewish history. And then they will try to understand what were the seeds, what came before what influenced what. We are too much within a transformation. It's very difficult to detach yourself from the present and take, a little bit higher look upon trends. But a century from now, a Jew, the personality of a Jew is going to be different than the personality of a Jew of the last 2,000 years. The Jewish religion is going to be different. The culture, the Jewish culture is going to be very different. Okay? And we are, you and me, we are in the transition times. And transition times are the most difficult. It's very noisy. There are a lot of things that are happening, and nobody is satisfied because everybody clings to the past, to whatever used to be common and known. But people are not aware that something fundamental is changing, and change is not exactly something that a humankind is accepting so easily. But it will change. Judaism has passed that threshold that we will probably remember 2020 in a very long time in our history. Very many years in the future, we'll remember that the year 2020, in which for the first time the largest Jewish community resides in Israel, the first time that the center of Judaism moved over there, the first time that the scholarship, Jewish scholars, the biggest Jewish, the most significant Jewish scholars will move towards Israel. And we can see it now in the last 2 decades or 3 decades. We don't see a scholarship that is coming out from diaspora, real scholarship, I mean. Now, not even in Israel, but in Israel, there are a lot of things that are behind the scene that are in the making. For example, in Israel, there is that movement of female rabbis within Orthodoxy that are having a new voice, different kinds of thinking, different kind of halachot, different kinds. It's still in its initial stage, but things are happening here, and their scholarship is being written now. It's being clarified. It will take another, half a century to clarify. But it will be when somebody will analyze history, will say, the beginning of the 21st century was such and such. Mid-21st century was already something very different. 50 years in history is nothing. The problem is that from a point of view of an individual, it's too much and it's too long. But it is not. Any other question, guys?
Yeah, there's a few more questions. Svi Simmons asks, what will Zionism mean in the fifth era, particularly to young non-Israeli Jews, young Jews in the diaspora who have no affinity or no interest in Israel? What does Zionism mean?
Can you repeat it? I didn't understand the question.
The question is, what does Zionism mean in this fifth era? How does it change? And particularly, what does it mean for the young Jews in the diaspora? Many of whom, as you said, have no affinity or interest in Israel.
Yeah. Well, by all means, Zionism was the most creative thing Jews have done in the last 120 years. Okay? that was something that brought together different parts of Jews from all over the world, different kinds of thinking, different denominations, etc., etc. Zionism did not exactly finish its role in history, not yet. Okay, I believe it will be only in the mid 21st century until we'll say, okay, the era of Zionism is over, because the idea of Zionism is just to build a homeland, to secure physically Jews from persecution that used to be during 2,000 years. That was the idea of Zionism. They didn't have an idea exactly what kind of a Jewish state they would like to establish. They knew they only wanted to establish a state, a homeland that will be secure enough so that the faith that Jews used to experience during the last 2,000 years, that vicious cycle of cruelty from different people all over the world, will cease to exist. That was the main idea of Zionism. Okay? They didn't have an idea what kind of a Jewish state should be that entity. They knew what kind of a state for Jews Israel should be. That's two different things. Okay? That's Zionism. Probably the era of Zionism will end mid 21st century, when 70% of world Jewry will reside in Israel. And then we will start another era. So we are at the last stage of Zionism in history. And that's why a lot of people in the world, and the young people more specifically, they do not, affiliate to the idea of Zionism, because there is already a state. So that's it. But we are also here in Melbourne. We are very safe. Unfortunately, history is not something safe to Jews. So time after time, anti-Semitism is raising its head. So at this point of time, a lot of people say, well, that's it. We don't need any more Zionism. The largest Jewish community resides there. We reside here. Go to your destiny and we go to our destiny, and that's it. Okay? In the meantime, Israel is developing, and more people are coming here. The fertility rate here in Israel is really very positive by all means compared to any Western and industrialized nation. And Israel will continue, and we will to redefine Zionism by mid 21st century. So Zionism, I'm not afraid that people are not that the young generation do not affiliate as we used to be with the term Zionism, because something else is in the making. I hope I explained myself.
Thank you. David Epstein points out that between the first four eras, there was about 500 years for each one,
yes.
But this is nearly 2,000 years.
That's it.
Does that negate the pattern? Is it really a pattern when there's such a difference?
Yeah, that's right. But the fourth era is the longest era, by all means, and it's not exactly a pattern. Nothing in history is it's not an exact science, but we are just trying to understand how things might evolve. By the way, the question should have been, from my point of view, is what's the predictive reliability of the pattern? That's how we term that kind of question. So we're speaking about something like 60 to 65%, at most 70% reliability. It's not 100%, but if you can say something with 60% reliability, that's really something unusual. And it doesn't say that whatever we think it might happen in the future, it's really something that definitely will happen. But these are just clues. And if you did not understand what future studies is, the aim of future studies is not to learn what will be in the future, who we are to understand what will be the future like. The whole idea of future studies is to understand the present a little bit different. That's it. Or if you wish, we were brought up to think that if we want to understand the present, we better go and study the past. We tend to say that's not enough. In order to understand a little bit better the present, let's take a look at the present also from the future and see if we can perceive the present a little bit different in order to be a little bit more efficient in whatever we're doing in the present. So I don't care if what I said will happen or not. That's not my aim. The whole idea is a little bit to understand the present differently and see what we can do to better the present and to make and to do whatever we do a little bit more efficient. That's the whole idea. That's the whole shtick in 2 phrases.
Thank you. I've got a question from Miriam Frommer. If women are going to be the future leaders, will it be those who don't have a large number of children who will have the time and energy to do this, or will the Kharadi women also be a part of this group?
All women will be part of it. It doesn't, by the way, it's not a gender issue. I see somebody here asked it. It's not a gender issue. It's not a feministic kind of thinking. No, it's a mindset. You can be with a mindset of a feminine mindset, but you are a man. It doesn't matter. Okay. So it's a way of thinking. It's not a gender issue. It's not an egalitarian issue. It's not a feministic kind of thing. Okay. So this is basically the idea. Any other question, guys?
Yes, there's a question from Devorah Wayner. To what extent does this Jewish transition mirror other global transitions?
Whoa, that's a big issue. That's another issue. But it is mirroring other things that are happening worldwide. For example, one of the issues that are happening worldwide is a clash between איך קוראים לזה, רשויות, the judicial, איך אומרים, הרשות המבצעת והרשות המחוקקת. Somebody would like to help me here?
I think it's not state law and I don't know. I don't know the legal terminology.
Well,
are you saying
there is a clash?
State and religion?
No. There is a clash between the judicial, let's say, establishment and the government, not the government, the elected representatives. Yes, the elected, exactly. So it's happening all over the world. It's happening also here in Israel. Who's the sovereign? The sovereign are the people that elect the politicians or the judges that have in their mind a different kind of laws. For example, in Israel, there is a clash that with the judicial establishment because they constantly void the authority of the Knesset to vote for some new bills. So this is something that is happening worldwide. And within Israel, it's part of something else that is happening. Who's the sovereign? But it needs to elaborate. I need to elaborate upon this point. This is not the time for it. In my book, I'm trying to give it some space to explain it.
Thank you. We're just about the end of our time. I might hand over to Rabbi Yonatan to thank you very much and for final words.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. But let me just finish. If you really have in mind a contact with a publishing, publishing press or something that will be interested in publishing this kind of book in English, let me know. because we have already translated the book. Half of it is already translated to English. Thank you so much for your patience and for my English accent. Probably it was not an easy one to listen to. I did my best, and I hope to see you in Melbourne and Sydney and wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rabbi.
Toda rabba.
And
Rabbi.
Toda rabba to Professor David Pasig. It's so generous of you to have offered all of this time to us here in the Australian community, both Sydney and Melbourne. And we really, really appreciate it. Your insights were so fascinating. People are still talking to me about the last lecture, and my daughter is clapping for you. So, and I'm sure everyone else is too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please send me, Jonathan, send me the recording of this Q&A, okay? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Good evening over there. Good evening.
Thank you. There are lots of things happening at Kehilat Nitzan. Have a look at our website and you'll find out all the opportunities for study and for prayer. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much to John Rosenberg.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.